Assalamu alaikum, dear students. Today is our second lecture, and it is about literary criticism, and it is about what is literary criticism. In the first lecture, I discussed briefly about criticism, what is criticism, and now this lecture is about what is literary criticism. About criticism, I told you that criticism is our way of judging any piece of work, anything that we do, or that we create, or that we make in this world. So we can do criticism. And I also gave you one question that what is more important, criticism or creation? If we have good criticism, then we have good creation. Creation doesn't mean that we will bring something entirely new. Creation means we have something, we have a model before us, and we see or observe that model. हम उस मॉडल को देखते हैं, देख कर उससे कोई नई चीज़ क्रिएट करते हैं. तो जब criticism proper way में होगा, then we will be able to have good creation. This is what you will find from one school of thought. In the same way, I gave you some general example. I gave you one example of sports that in cricket, only those who have spent time in international cricket, playing on international pitches as a batsman or as a bowler, so they can criticize better than normal cricketers or ordinary cricketers who have no experience of international level. So for critics, definitely there are certain rules and regulations. So when we do general criticism, so we have, of course, rules and regulations. So here, now we are talking about, I'm telling you about literary criticism that is related to literature. So what is literary criticism? Literary criticism is the study of evaluation and interpretation of literature. How we evaluate and then we interpret a piece of work that is related to literature. This is what we call literary criticism. Now, when we evaluate and interpret, so what do? We tell good and bad both points. Normally, people think that criticism means only talking about negative points. आपसे किसी भी चीज़ की जिस पे भी आप क्रिटिसाइज करें, शख्स चीज़ जगह कुछ भी हो, उसके खाली मनफी जो उसके पॉइंट्स है वो आप सामने लाते हैं, यानी कि उस पर आप सिर्फ नेगेटिव तनकीद करते हैं और कोई पॉजिटिव बात उसकी नहीं करते, ना ही उसकी कोई पॉजिटिव क्वालिटी को आप सामने लाते हैं. सो दिस इज नॉट लाइक दिस. Here, criticism means you talk about both points, good and bad, so that you can bring further improvement in that piece of work or in that particular thing. So similarly, in literary criticism, what do we do? It is definitely related to literary studies, and we evaluate and interpret a piece of work or of literature. Modern literary criticism is often influenced by literary theory, which is the philosophical discussion of literature's goals and methods. This is what we have about modern literary criticism. Though both these activities are very closely related, literary critics are not always, or they have not always been theorists. यहाँ पे ये हमेशा theorists नहीं रहे, though they both are very closely related to each other. If we talk about literary criticism, so we can see the name of Plato on the top of the list. Again, if we talk about literary criticism, so we can find the name of Plato on the top of the list. And it is said that literary criticism begins properly from Plato. It's more than 2,000 years back. Plato criticized poets and poetry. Actually, Plato was himself a poet, but later on he became philosopher. When he saw that poets were not doing their jobs properly, he knew the great power of poet, but unfortunately they were not doing their job in a proper manner. As we can see at the present time, जैसा कि आज के दौर में हम देख सकते हैं कि शायर जो हैं वो उस तरह से काम नहीं कर रहे जिस तरह से उनको करना चाहिए। मिसाल के तौर पर शायर गाने लिखता है, नज़में लिखता है, जिनको गाया जाता है, पढ़ा जाता है। अब इन नज़्मों में क्या है? What do we have in these poems? What do we have in these songs? Of course, unfortunately nowadays again you will find bad things, vulgar elements. You will find things which arouse our bad feelings, जो हमारी bad feelings को arouse कर रहा होता है। ठीक है, तो इससे क्या होता है कि बुरे जज्बात होते हैं जिनको सप्रेस रहने चाहिए। अच्छे जज्बात बहुत ही कम आपको मिलेंगे कि वो उनको मतलब ये अराउज किया जाए। So that time, when Plato was writing, there were problems in his age. There was no political stability, and of course, they were going through a very tough time. So he found that poets were not doing their job properly, and that is why he, as a philosopher, presented the idea of an ideal state, and from that ideal state, he banished all the poets. What he said, उसने क्या कहा था कि when poets come to your uh, when poets come to your state or country, give them a lot of respect. Give them a lot of respect, revere them, but after giving them a lot of respect and reverence, kick them out. Kick them out. Why? Because they are very powerful, but they are not using their power in a proper manner. That's why they should be. They should not be allowed to stay in your city, country, or state. So in the fourth century, we see Aristotle wrote the Poetics, and a typology and description of literary forms with many specific criticism of contemporary works of art. Poetics developed for the first time the concept of mimesis. In this poetics, he also criticized poetry in which he talks about imitation, and he criticized that imitation by saying that it is twice or thrice removed from the reality, and catharsis, which are still crucial in literary studies. So Plato attacked on poetry and poet. और उसके रिस्पॉन्स में इसके ही एक तालिब इलम एरिस्टोटल, जिसको अरस्तु कहा जाता है, he wrote poetics in which he replied to his teacher. He replied to the criticism of certain things which his teacher made. So, inshallah, we will start, with Aristotle, with Plato. I will tell you some history of literary criticism from the very beginning. I'll tell you about the age of Plato and the significant things which were happening in that particular age, and why Plato criticized poets and poetry, and what he said, how he criticized them. This is inshallah we'll discuss in the later classes in the third class session, and then we will start inshallah with poetics, in which you will find uh, uh, Aristotle defending poets and poetry against the attack of his teacher Plato, and he is presenting, the good real definition of tragedy, what tragedy is, and the six elements of tragedy. This is inshallah will start from the next week, the third session. Now, let me tell you a few things about the classification of different edges, classification of different classification of different edges. Before starting the third class, the third session, I would like to tell you a few things about the classification of different edges. I don't know whether you remember or whether you have this in your knowledge or not, but let me tell you, okay, English edges, because we are studying English literature, so we will focus on English. Different edges in English literature, along with renowned literary critics and their works. और उन खास तौर पर renowned literary critics की बात मैं कर रहा हूँ जिनको हमने पढ़ना भी है. Okay, when we study different edges in English literature, we find Renaissance first. Renaissance with the reign of Queen Elizabeth. Renaissance is called or considered to be the best age from English drama point of view, because English because Renaissance is the age in which you will find that English dramas or plays were at their height. Playwrights like Shakespeare was there, and Marlowe was Christopher Marlowe was there, and of course there were many other great literary figures. You will find Spencer was writing, Sir Philip Sidney was there, and there were also some other very big names. So especially it is the age that is very famous and that is very renowned from English drama point of view, and it saw writers like uh, Shakespeare, like Christopher Marlowe. It begins with the reign of Queen Elizabeth and it ends almost when the Queen dies. And it is the period of almost 60 to 70 years. And it is said that it begins after 1537 when Queen Elizabeth became queen, and then when she died in 1603. So this age is almost was almost dying out, and then we have uh, you know the other period that is also called Miltonic period. That period the period between Restoration and Renaissance is completely dominated by a poet who was also, to some extent, a critic, John Milton. John Milton wrote, and you'll also find that time when Sir Francis Bacon's essays were also being written. He was also writing his essays, and he had great role to play in prose. And it is said that prose writing or prose was elevated thanks to uh, Sir Francis Bacon. Before Sir Francis Bacon's essays, there was no significant thing in prose, and that is why dramatists were using poetry for their dramas. They were not using prose, which is easy to understand. So, and it was also the time when Puritans were dominating the scene, and so this is the time of John Milton, Miltonic period we can also call it. And here you also find Jacobean period, King Jacob's time. So, and Puritans' dominance was there. When Puritans came, definitely there was a complete silence in literary world because they banned all types of poetry except religious and moral poetry and poetry related to heroes. Such poetry were allowed to be published. Otherwise, no other work, dramas, all the theaters were closed, and all such types of poetry were forbidden to be written. Milton, unfortunately, had to engage himself in writing prose for 20 years, almost from 1637 or 1638 to 1658, just before Restoration period. Milton was definitely a poet, but he had to spend 20 golden years in prose unwillingly. And if you know, Milton was, and he is definitely renowned for his Paradise Lost. He was a highly qualified, highly educated person, and it was his dream to write something exceptional for the whole world from religious point of view, and it was Paradise Lost. He wrote this. The idea of writing such a great piece of work was in his mind from the very beginning, and for this he gained world knowledge. He visited different places. He visited different places and he gained knowledge from his own experience from different places. And then finally, when he got ready to write this great work, so unfortunately he had to participate in politics because Milton was himself on Puritan, and it was a time when Puritans dominated the parliament, and Cromwell became the new head of the state of the country. And the King Charles was arrested. Then later on, he was beheaded, and his family was sent on exile. उनको जिलावतन कर दिया गया, और इस तरह से प्यूरिटन की हुकूमत आई. लेकिन जब क्रॉमवेल की डेथ हुई इन 1653 और 4, देन अगेन, क्योंकि जब क्रॉमवेल की हुकूमत आई तो लोग बहुत परेशान हो गए थे, बहुत सख्तियाँ हो गई थी, वो जो उसने बातें की थी लोग उससे वो काफ़ी हद तक फिर गया था और लोगों के लिए बड़ी सख्तियाँ शुरू हो गई थी, बहुत सख्त मामला हो गए थे, थिएटर्स बंद, हर अक्सर चीज़ों पर पाबंदियाँ लग गई। और मुझे याद है कि मिल्टन ने एक ऐसे लिखा था, ही रोट एन ऐसे बिकॉज मिल्टन मैरिड फर्स्ट टाइम टू अ लेडी। मिल्टन वाज अ रिलीजियस बेंट ऑफ माइंड, मिल्टन एक मजहबी शख्स था लेकिन वो प्योरिटन्स की तरह he was not like them very narrow minded. He was a puritan, but he was uh, he he used to write poetry and all such things, and he had that you can say stamina. When he married to a lady, the lady was of half age. The lady was almost of his half age, and she was a little fashionable lady. So their marriage could not last even for 2 months, and she went back to her father's home. अपने फादर के यहाँ चली गई और उसका कोई इरादा नहीं था वापस आने का। मिल्टन भी फिर मिल्टन ने भी सोच लिया कि वो उसे वापस नहीं लाएगा और वो उसे डिवोर्स दे देगा, लेकिन अनफॉर्चुनेटली दे वर नॉट अलाउड टू गिव डिवोर्स। वो उनके पास ये फ्रीडम नहीं थी, दे वर नॉट अलाउड, दे हैड नो फ्रीडम टू गिव डिवोर्स। इस पर मिल्टन ने एक ऐसे लिखा, he wrote an essay to the member of parliament, and he was himself definitely amongst them. He was very happy and he was very confident that the parliament would listen to him, and the law would be changed, and they would give freedom of giving divorce. But unfortunately this did not happen, ऐसा हुआ नहीं। मिल्टन was very much disappointed, वो भी बहुत मायूस हुआ ये सब देखकर, ऐसा हुआ नहीं। और उसकी वाइफ को उसके पास आना पड़ा और उनकी शादी तकरीबन वो दोनों एक साथ तकरीबन 6-7 साल मस्जिद रहे। और उसके बाद in 1653 I think yes she died, and in the same year Milton became blind। उसी साल मिल्टन जो है उसकी आंखें वो ब्लाइंड हो गया था। आंखें तो शुरू से कमज़ोर थी लेकिन उसी साल वो ब्लाइंड भी हो गया था। इस शादी से उनकी 2 बेटियां भी थी। तो कहने का मतलब ये है कि मिल्टन ने काफ़ी ऐसे लिखे, एंड वन ऑफ द एसेज ऑफ मिल्टन इज एरियोपेजिटिका, in which he talks about the freedom of printing books without any restrictions, freedom of expression and freedom of printing books। क्योंकि एक लॉ पास किया गया था उस दौर में by Puritans that no book would be published without attaining license or without being licensed or without attaining license, यानी कि लाइसेंस और अप्रूवल के बगैर कोई भी किताब पब्लिश नहीं होगी। सो दिस you know you can say enraged Milton, and he wrote one essay for the freedom of printing books, but unfortunately nothing happened. So when Cromwell died, so people again decided to call the family of the king back, and in this way 1664 जो था वो किंगशिप रिस्टोर्ड हुआ, और इस ईयर को रेस्टोरेशन का नाम दिया जाता है। जैसे किंगशिप रिस्टोर हुआ तो जो प्योरिटन्स थे उनको चुन चुनकर मारा गया, कत्ल किया गया। मिल्टन को भी पकड़ लिया गया, लेकिन मिल्टन चूंकि उसके बड़े अच्छे ताल्लुकात थे और काफ़ी लिंक थे, और वो एक साफ सुथरा और वो एक स्ट्रेट फॉरवर्ड बंदा था, तो ही वाज लेफ्ट। उसके उन लिंक्स उन्होंने बचा लिया, एंड देन ही पेड हिज फुल अटेंशन टू हिज literary works, and he wrote Paradise 1, Paradise Lost 1, Paradise Lost 2, August Sampson, and I guess again और इस तरह से उसने अपने बड़े बड़े जो काम थे वो किए। After this period we have new classical age। New classical age is probably considered to be the longest age in the history of English literature। तकरीबन इंग्लिश लिटरेचर में सबसे लंबा जो एज है वो न्यू क्लासिकल एज है। It begins after 1770 and it ends almost in 1880। It is said that new classical age begins with Dryden and ends with Dr. Johnson। इस एज को के कुछ हिस्सों को ऑगस्टन एज भी कहा जाता है, बिकॉज द राइटर ऑफ दिस एज थॉट दैट दे वर very good at writing, and they were as good at writing as the writers of the Augustan age of ancient time। This age is completely dominated by satire, whether it was in prose or poetry, but it was the age of satire। And you will find here Rules, they were bound to rules and regulations. It was the age of reason, no emotions, no feelings. इस एज में आपको की राइटिंग में ना आपको इमोशंस का जिक्र मिलेगा ना फीलिंग्स का. Yes, they were paying more attention to style rather than subject. So it is probably the longest age of English literature in the history of English literature. ये वही दौर है जिसमें first English dictionary भी निकाली गई. It was written by Dr. Johnson, which was used for more than 100 years as an authentic source. And it is a time when Alexander Pope was very active in the domain of poetry. You will find it is the time when novels, the new form of literature, novel started. रॉबिन्सन क्रूसो की भी आपको मतलब ये नॉवल मिलेगी. और इस ही दौर में आपको यू विल फाइंड जॉन ड्राइडन. ही वाज नॉट ओनली अ पोएट बट आल्सो अ क्रिटिक. And you'll also find the name of Dr. Johnson, some big, other big names. After this age, we have Romantic movement, Romantic era, and it is said that Romantic era began with the publication of lyrical ballads in 1798, and it ended, or it remained, it ended till 18. It ended in 1830. It is probably the shortest age in the history of English literature, but very electrifying age. You will find, you know, the writers, they spoke or they reacted against the new classical age. They were sick of the new classical age, and the definition of poetry also can be. You can also read the definition of poetry, which is very interesting. क्या है इसकी definition of poetry? ये क्या कहते हैं poetry के बारे में? Poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feeling. Poetry is a spontaneous overflow of powerful feeling. So they say that if there is no feeling, there is no poetry. न्यू क्लासिकल एज में फीलिंग की कोई अहमियत नहीं थी. दे वर टॉकिंग अबाउट रीजन, अकल की बात करते थे वो लोग. दे वर टॉकिंग अबाउट रीजन, बट हियर यू विल फाइंड दे आर टॉकिंग अबाउट फीलिंग्स. They both are opposite to each other. New classical age and romantic movement, they both were romantic age. They both were against each other. They were both against. They were both anti. निकोला रोमांटिक मूवमेंट में और एज में आपको जो राइटर्स नजर आएंगे, they didn't talk about their age, but they talk about nature. They talk about village life. They talk about simple life. They talk about rustic language. They talk about the sea. They talk about jungle, forest, shepherds. इस तरह की चीजें आपको मिलेंगी. न्यू क्लासिकल एज में आपको फैशनेबल लेडीज, लॉर्ड्स, जेंटलमैन, सिटी लाइफ, इस पर जोर मिलेगा. So romantic movement जो थी और एज जो था ये तकरीबन it was the shortest period in the history of English literature, and till 1830 you will find romantic period, and the famous romantic poets like John Keats, Wordsworth, probably the most famous poet and complete representative of romantic age, Coleridge, Byron, Shelley. These are some very famous names, and you'll also find one named Jane Austen. She was also there, but she had her own limitations. After Romantic movement, you will find Queen Victorians. You will find Victorian period, and this probably, the most important period from material prosperity point of view and from novel point of view. Romantic age is completely dominated by poetry. Victorian period is completely dominated by novel fiction. Victorian age begins with the reign of Queen Victoria. क्वीन विक्टोरिया जब दौरे हुकूमत पर आती है उससे विक्टोरियन एज शुरू होता है और तकरीबन ये 1900 तक चलता है. दो क्वीन डाइड इन 1903 बट इट यू विल फाइंड द इम्पैक्ट ऑफ दिस एज टिल 1900, and it is considered, it is said that it is the best period from material point of view. मादी यानी कि from prosperity point of view it is the best age. Though this age has many other problems, you'll find rise of democracy in this age. You'll find religious controversial issues in this particular age. You will find cities were being burdened, villages were being abandoned. You will find industrialization of this age में मिलेगा. You will find a lot of injustice in this age, but you'll also find middle class. तीन classes इस age में नजर आती है. First, you will find upper class and middle class and lower class. Middle class के आप इस एज में देखेंगे, they were rising day by day. They were becoming more, they were gaining wealth day by day, or poor class, they were going down day by day, and upper class, they were just enjoying their life. तो इसमें आपको मेथी ऑनर जो इस पीरियड में आपको विक्टोरियन पीरियड में आपको जो बड़े नाम नजर आएंगे वो मैकडॉनल्ड नजर आएगा एज अ पोइट एंड क्रिटिक, और उसकी हम क्रिटिसिज्म भी पढ़ेंगे बाकायदा, लिटरेरी क्रिटिसिज्म एंड ऑल्सो सोशल क्रिटिसिज्म. You will find the name of poet name uh, you'll find novelists like after Victorian period we have modern period. Modern period is called 20th century, and you'll find different uh, divisions of modern period like pre-modern, middle period, and modern period. So you'll find modern period, and the big name in modern period is of T.S. Eliot, and his essay, inshallah, we will also study. Modern period is, different from other periods. Why? Because here you will find the role of psychology very dominant. And if you remember in the last, in the previous semester, we studied the characteristics of modern literature, and we found that it was completely dominated by psychology because of certain very important elements, especially World War One and then World War Two after 15 or 17 years, and these both wars brought complete change in the life, in the attitude of people, and in many things. So psychology, human psychology became very important. You'll find the theory of Freud. You'll find many other, such people in this arena, and people's lives, people's concept of life change, and many other changes you'll find in this particular age. Many things which were considered taboo, बहुत सी चीज़ें जो कि बेहुदा समझी जाती थी, बुरी समझी जाती थी in Victorian period, now in 20th century they are considered acceptable, and they are not considered any more taboo and offensive and all such things. So ये क्लासिफिकेशन थी जो मैंने आपको थोड़ा डिटेल में बताया, लेकिन इंशाल्लाह आगे हम इसको पढ़ेंगे मजीद. Literary criticism in Renaissance. So Sir Philip Sidney's Apology of Poetry is a significant work of criticism in which Sidney defends poetry against the attack of Stephen Gosson. सिडनी ऑल्सो डिफाइंस पोइट्री, पोइट्री को भी डिफाइन करता है, उसके टाइप ऑफ फंक्शन को भी डिफाइन करता है. ही ट्राइज टू प्रूव द सुपीरियरिटी ऑफ पोइट्री ओवर अदर ब्रांचेस ऑफ नॉलेज, और ये सब कुछ किस में करता है? हिज वर्क अपॉलजी फॉर पोइट्री जो हम पढ़ेंगे, विच वी विल स्टडी इंशाल्लाह in literary criticism, and he's the product of Renaissance. Just before Restoration, you will find the name of Milton as a critic. Though he was not a critic, Milton याद है कि critic नहीं था, he was a poet. He was a poet, but you will study him as a critic. Aeropagitica, you may see his work Aeropagitica, which was a speech written for the freedom of printing books to the member of the parliament of that time, जिसमें उसने freedom of printing books के हवाले से बात की है. Then New Classical Era. In New Classical Era, you will study John Dryden's essay on dramatic poesy, in which you will find a discussion of modern plays and ancient plays. In दोनों में क्या फर्क है? Modern plays कैसे ancient plays कैसे थे? English plays and French plays, and you'll find a discussion of verses like rhyme verse and blank verse, the differences between both of them, and what should be better. Miss ये चीज़ें आपको इस तरह की discussion आपको मिलेंगी in this particular piece of work, which is written by, or which was written by John Dryden, and he is the it is said that New Classical Era began with John Dryden, and ended New Classical Era began with John Dryden and ended with Dr. Johnson's death. सो डॉक्टर जॉनसन का पैराफ्रेज तो शेक्सपियर में हम पढ़ेंगे, जिसमें हम डॉक्टर जॉनसन क्रिटिसाइज शेक्सपियर्स वर्क. ही टॉक्स अबाउट मेरिट्स एंड डिमेरिट्स ऑफ शेक्सपियर्स प्लेस. एंड देन यू विल फाइंड इन रोमांटिक एज में जो क्रिटिसिज्म हम पढ़ेंगे वो हम पढ़ेंगे वर्ड्सवर्थ पैराफ्रेज टू लिरिकल बैलेड, probably the most important uh, piece of work from criticism point of view in Romantic Age. And when we read this one, so we realize what Romantic poetry is and why it was written, and what were the causes and reasons for writing this kind of poetry. So the aim of new kind of poetry, flaws and faults in neoclassical poetry, subject is given more importance than style. These and there are many other some other topics which you will study in Wordsworth's preface to lyrical ballads. फिर उसके बाद है Coleridge's biography literary. He is also the product of Romantic age, and you'll find him as a critic. He was also a poet as well as critic. मैंने जैसे कि आपसे कहा कि Wordsworth was not a critic, but he became critic. Why? Because he wrote preface to lyrical ballad in which he criticized new classical writers, and he mentioned why he wrote new kind of poetry. That is why we study preface to lyrical ballads as a critical document. We study it as a work of criticism. And Coleridge biography literature उसमें क्या है हमारे पास the most important thing in biography literature is imagination and fancy. The difference between imagination, what is imagination first, and then imagination में वो kinds बता रहा होता है, primary and secondary imagination, और उसके बाद fancy के बताता है, फिर इन दोनों के दरमियान फर्क भी बताता है. So this is probably the most important one, and then you will find he replies to Wordsworth. Wordsworth का एक जुमला होता है जो वो कहता है, और उस पर वो जो है उसके दोस्त पॉलिस को बहुत बुरा लगता है, जिस पर बाकायदा जवाब देता है इन हिज दिस वर्क बायोग्राफी लिटरेरी. वो जुमला ये था, वर्ड्सवर्थ ने कहा था कि देयर इज नो एसेंशियल डिफरेंस. वर्ड्सवर्थ ने क्या कहा था, देयर इज नो एसेंशियल डिफरेंस बिटवीन द लैंग्वेज ऑफ प्रोज एंड पोइट्री. वो इतना इस हद तक आगे निकल गया था कि वो कहता है कि प्रोज और पोइट्री के दरमियान कोई खास डिफरेंस नहीं है. जिसके जवाब में कॉलेज लिखता है डिटेल में, मैं सिर्फ आपको चंद बातें बता रहा हूँ. He says there is an essential difference between the language of prose and poetry, and that difference is meter. If you don't use meter in poetry, so it will become prose, and then there will be no difference between both of them. And definitely, poetry has certain rules and regulations. So meter is the essential difference between both of them. तो ये उससे क्रिटिसाइज करता है और इसमें इस चीज़ को मेंशन करता है. When we have Victorian era, in Victorian era we have Matthew Arnold's essays. Especially you will study बहुत सारे essays है, लेकिन हम जो study करेंगे वो ये हैं, the study of poetry in which he tells us about poetry. क्या poetry होती क्या है, उसके क्या certain चीज़ें हैं, जिसमें एक बहुत interesting चीज़ है poetry की definition. वो क्या कहता है कि poetry is a criticism of life under certain conditions. वर्ड्सवर्थ ने कहा था पोइट्री इज अ स्पॉन्टेनियस ओवरफ्लो ऑफ पावरफुल फीलिंग, और ये कहता है पोइट्री इज अ क्रिटिसिज्म ऑफ लाइफ अंडर सर्टेन कंडीशंस. तो ये इसका ऐसे है जिसमें पोइट्री के बारे में बताता है, पोइट्स के बारे में बताता है. ठीक है. एंड देन यू विल फाइंड एक और ऐसे है इसका क्रिटिसिज्म के हवाले से, वो मैं लिखना भूल गया. सो इन विच ही टेल्स अस अबाउट व्हाट इज क्रिटिसिज्म, और उसमें भी एक बहुत ज़बरदस्त जुमला है जिसने कहा, जिसको याद रखिएगा आप लोग. क्रिटिसिज्म के हवाले से कहते हैं कि क्रिटिसिज्म इज a disinterested endeavor to know the best thing that has been said and known in the world. What is criticism? Criticism is a disinterested endeavor to know the best thing that has been known and said in the world. इसके अलावा वो वर्ड्सवर्थ के ऊपर क्रिटिसिज्म लिखता है, जॉन कीट्स के काम पर, उसके कैरेक्टर पर क्रिटिसिज्म लिखता है, जो आप पढ़ेंगे. देन 20th सेंचुरी जो है टी एस एलियट के बगैर, द मोस्ट इंपॉर्टेंट फिगर ऑफ 20th सेंचुरी टी एस एलियट. और भी फिगर्स आपको मिलेंगे, लेकिन टी एस एलियट इन क्रिटिसिज्म वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट. हिज एसे द मेटाफिजिकल पोइट्स, इट इज सेड अबाउट मेटाफिजिकल पोइट्स के मेटाफिजिकल जॉन डन के बारे में खास तौर पर, जॉन डन वो शायर था जिसको उसकी ज़िंदगी में तो दूर के बाद उसके मरने के 200 साल तक कोई नहीं जानता था. It was T.S. Eliot who brought metaphysical poet like John Donne to the surface, and he brought the beauty of John Donne. उसे बताया मेटाफिजिकल पोइट्री असल में होती क्या और जॉन डन का क्या मुकाम था. Then tradition and individual talent. T.S. Eliot is giving importance to tradition, and he's telling us how important tradition is for an individual talent. You will study this thing in this particular essay. So this is how, inshallah, we'll study literary criticism, and I hope, inshallah, after when you study literary criticism in a proper manner, so inshallah, it will open your eyes to many things. याद रखिएगा literary criticism is a subject which covers all other subjects. It is a subject which deals with all other subjects. अगर आप इसको सही मानों में पढ़ेंगे तो आपको पता चलेगा कि आपने वाकई कुछ पढ़ा है. It deal because it has a connection, it has it links with all other subjects. ऐसा नहीं है कि ये किसी एक सब्जेक्ट के साथ इसका ताल्लुक मखसूस है. नो, इट इज समथिंग दैट इज लिंक्ड विद ऑल. व्हाई? बिकॉज इट इज क्रिटिसिज्म. एंड विच क्रिटिसिज्म? लिटरेरी क्रिटिसिज्म. तो जो कुछ आज के लेक्चर हमने आज के लेक्चर में हमने पढ़ा, टुडेज लेक्चर वी हैव डिस्कस व्हाट इज क्रिटिसिज्म एंड व्हाट critics we are going to study inshallah in this semester. So this is what we have done. If you have any questions regarding this, you can ask me now, or you can ask me inshallah in the third session. Okay, with this I conclude my session. If you have any queries, any question, you can ask please.